Sometimes, when life strips away everything you hold dear, the most unexpected door opens to save you. When young Ellyn collapses at the gates of a dark mansion, homeless and desperate, she never imagined the master inside would change her fate forever. Lord Caelan is no ordinary man. He's a vampire who has lived alone for centuries. Ellyn only wants work as a servant, but something about her reminds him of a love he lost long ago. As she cleans his empty halls, they both feel a strange connection growing between them. Then one night, he makes her an offer that will change everything. Be my mate. She must choose between the hard life she knows or a mysterious new world with him. Will love be enough to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron gates of Blackmoor Hall stood like silent sentinels against the autumn mist, their intricate scrollwork casting twisted shadows across the cobblestone courtyard. Beyond them loomed a mansion that seemed carved from the very darkness itself, grey stone weathered by centuries, tall windows that reflected nothing, and ivy that crept up its walls like grasping fingers. This was where Ellyn's desperate journey had led her, to a place that whispered of secrets and sorrow. She had been walking for 3 days, her worn boots growing thinner with each mile, her stomach hollow with hunger that gnawed at her like a living thing. The last village had turned her away, another mouth they could not feed, another burden they could not bear. The innkeeper's wife had looked at her with pity before closing the door, leaving Ellyn to face the approaching storm alone. Now, as she pressed her face against the cold metal of the gates, Ellyn felt the last of her strength ebb away. Her fingers traced the ancient family crest embedded in the ironwork, a raven perched upon a crescent moon, wings spread as if ready to take flight into eternal night. She had seen this symbol in her dreams, though she could not say why. "Please," she whispered to the empty air, her breath forming small clouds in the chill. "I need only work, a place to sleep, a crust of bread. I can clean, I can mend, I can tend gardens." Her voice carried across the courtyard, seeming to echo off the stone walls of the mansion beyond. As if summoned by her plea, the sound of hoofbeats emerged from the swirling mist. A horse and rider materialized from the shadows, a magnificent black stallion whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and upon his back a figure that made Ellyn's breath catch in her throat. Lord Caelan Blackmoor sat his mount with the easy grace of one born to command. His hair was dark as a moonless night, his features sharp and aristocratic, but it was his eyes that held her pale as winter ice, ancient beyond his apparent years. He wore a long coat that billowed behind him like dark wings, and when he looked down at her through the gates, Ellyn felt as though he could see into her very soul. "What brings a young woman to my gates at such an hour?" His voice was deep, cultured, with an accent that spoke of old nobility and older secrets. There was no cruelty in it, but neither was there warmth, only a careful distance that suggested long practice in keeping the world at arm's length. Ellyn straightened despite her exhaustion, lifting her chin with the last remnant of her pride. "I seek employment, my lord. I am skilled in household duties, and ask only for shelter and simple fare in return for honest work." Something flickered across his pale features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots making no sound as they touched the ground. As he approached the gates, Ellyn noticed how the mist seemed to part before him, how the very air grew still in his presence. "What is your name?" he asked, his fingers resting on the iron between them. "Ellyn Thorne, my lord." She met his gaze steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "I am the last of my family, with nowhere else to turn." The name seemed to strike him like a physical blow. His hand tightened on the gate, and for a moment his composed mask slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. "Thorne," he repeated softly, as if tasting a memory. "And from whence do you come, Ellyn Thorne?" "From Millhaven village, my lord, though before that I cannot say. I was raised in the foundling house there, after my parents died of fever." She did not mention the strange dreams that had begun months ago. Dreams of this very place, of corridors she had never walked, and gardens she had never seen. Lord Caelan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the pale moonlight. Then, with a sound like a sigh, he produced an ornate key and unlocked the gates. They swung open, silently, as if they had been waiting all along for this moment. "Come," he said simply. "Missus, Hartwell will see to your needs." As Ellyn stepped through the gates, she felt a strange tingling in the air, as if she had crossed more than just a threshold of iron and stone. The courtyard stretched before her, lined with ancient oak trees, whose branches intertwined overhead like a natural cathedral. Moonlight filtered through their leaves, casting ever-shifting patterns across the ground. The mansion itself was even more imposing up close. Gothic spires reached toward the star-scattered sky, and countless windows gazed down like watchful eyes. Some were dark, but others flickered with warm candlelight, suggesting life within the shadowed walls. The main entrance was reached by a sweep of stone steps that curved gracefully upward, flanked by stone gargoyles whose expressions seemed to change in the dancing shadows. "The estate has been in my family for generations," Lord Caelan said. As they climbed the steps, his voice carefully neutral. "It requires considerable maintenance, and we are always in need of reliable staff." He paused at the massive oak doors, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns of roses and thorns. "However, I must warn you, Blackmore Hall is not like other houses. Strange things occur here, sounds in the night, shadows where none should be. Many find the atmosphere unsettling." Ellyn looked up at him, noting the way the moonlight seemed to make his pale skin almost luminescent. "I have known stranger things than an old house with its moods, my lord. Loneliness and hunger are far more frightening to me than shadows and sounds." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had seen from him. Spoken like one who has learned wisdom through hardship. "Very well, Ellyn Thorne. Welcome to Blackmore Hall." The doors opened before they could reach them, revealing a woman of perhaps 50 years with silver-streaked hair pulled back in, a neat bun, and kind brown eyes that seemed to hold their own secrets. She wore the simple black dress of a housekeeper, but carried herself with quiet dignity. "Mrs. Hartwell," Lord Caelan said with a slight bow. "This is Miss Ellyn Thorne. She has come seeking employment and shelter. Mrs." Hartwell's gaze moved between them with interest, lingering on Ellyn's face with something that might have been recognition. "Of course, my lord. Miss Thorne, welcome to Blackmore Hall." Her voice was warm and maternal, a stark contrast to her master's careful reserve. "You look half-starved, child. Come, let us see you fed and settled." The interior of the mansion was as breathtaking as it was intimidating. The entry hall rose 2 stories high, its vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of celestial beauty, angels and stars, moons in all their phases, and creatures of myth dancing across a midnight sky. A grand staircase swept upward in elegant curves, its banister carved from dark wood and polished to a mirror shine. Tapestries hung along the walls depicting scenes of medieval life, and suits of armor stood at attention in shadowed alcoves. "The house has 47 rooms, Mrs." Hartwell explained as she led Ellyn deeper into the mansion, their footsteps echoing off marble floors. "Lord Caelan occupies the west wing, while the staff quarters are in the east. We maintain the common areas, the library, the conservatory, and the grounds. It is a large estate, but we manage well enough." Ellyn noticed that despite the house's size, they encountered no other servants. "How many others work here?" she asked, as they passed through a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow their movement. "You would be the third, Mrs." Hartwell replied with a slight hesitation. "There is Thomas, who maintains the grounds and stables, and myself. Lord Caelan prefers a small, trusted staff to a large household. They paused before a portrait that made Ellyn's breath catch. It depicted a young woman with dark hair and eyes like her own, wearing a gown of deep blue silk. The woman's face was hauntingly beautiful, but there was sadness in her expression that seemed to reach across the centuries. "Lady Isabel Blackmore," Mrs. Hartwell said softly, "Lord Caelan's ancestor. She lived here long ago, before tragedy befell the family." The housekeeper's voice carried a weight of unspoken knowledge. Some say her spirit still walks these halls, searching for peace that has long eluded her. Ellyn found she could not look away from the portrait. Something about the woman's face seemed familiar, as if she were looking into a mirror that reflected not her present self, but some hidden aspect of her soul. "What tragedy?" she asked. "Love that was forbidden, a choice that brought both salvation and sorrow." "Mrs." Hartwell's words were carefully chosen. "The details are lost to time, but the Blackmore family has always been touched by forces beyond the ordinary world. Lord Caelan himself carries the weight of that legacy." They continued through the mansion, past rooms that spoke of faded grandeur and careful preservation. The library was vast, its shelves reaching from floor to ceiling and filled with volumes that seemed to whisper secrets in languages both familiar and strange. The conservatory was filled with plants that bloomed despite the season, their flowers gleaming like jewels in the dim light. Finally, they reached the servants' quarters in the east wing. Mrs. Hartwell showed Ellyn to a small but comfortable room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the mansion's gardens. The room was clean and welcoming, with fresh linens and a warm woolen blanket. "Meals are served in the kitchen at dawn, midday, and dusk," Mrs. Hartwell explained. "Your duties will begin tomorrow cleaning the main halls, tending the fires, and whatever other tasks arise. Lord Caelan keeps unusual hours, often sleeping during the day and walking the halls at night. You may hear his footsteps above, but do not be alarmed." As if summoned by her words, the sound of movement echoed from somewhere in the mansion's slow, measured steps that seemed to pace back and forth with restless energy. Ellyn felt a strange pull, as if something called to her from within those shadowed corridors. "One final word of caution," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Lord Caelan is a good man, but he carries burdens that would break lesser souls. He has known great loss, great loneliness. Be kind to him, child, but guard your heart well. Some wounds run too deep for mortal healing." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Ellyn sat on the edge of her bed and gazed out the window at the gardens below. In the moonlight, she could see elaborate pathways winding between carefully tended beds, where roses bloomed in impossible profusion. At the center of the garden stood a fountain whose waters caught and scattered the moon's reflection like scattered diamonds. As she watched, a figure emerged from the shadows. Lord Caelan, walking slowly among the roses with his hands clasped behind his back. Even at this distance, she could see the weight of solitude that hung about him like a cloak. He moved like a man searching for something he had lost long ago, something that might never be found again. Without quite knowing why, Ellyn pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window. At that very moment, Lord Caelan looked up, his pale eyes finding hers across the distance. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in that shared gaze, two souls recognizing something indefinable in each other. Then he inclined his head in a slight bow and disappeared once more into the shadows. Ellyn remained at the window long into the night, watching the gardens and wondering what strange fate had brought her to this place of beauty and mystery. She thought of the portrait of Lady Isabel, of Mrs. Hartwell's warnings, of the way Lord Caelan's eyes had seemed to hold centuries of secrets. As sleep finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with corridors of moonlight and shadow, with roses that bloomed eternal, and with pale eyes that watched over her with an intensity that spoke of recognition, of longing, and of a love that had somehow transcended the boundaries of time itself. The wind sighed through the ancient stones of Blackmore Hall, carrying with it the whisper of destiny awakening, of two hearts drawn together by forces older than memory and stronger than death. Dawn broke grey and subdued over Blackmore Hall, filtering through the tall windows of Ellyn's chamber like pale silk. She had slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by corridors that seemed both foreign and familiar, by whispered voices speaking words she could not quite understand. Now, in the quiet light of morning, those visions felt distant as mist, yet their echo lingered in her heart. Mrs. Hartwell had left a simple grey dress and white apron outside her door, along with a pair of sturdy shoes that fit her feet perfectly, too perfectly, as if they had been made for her alone. The fabric of the dress was fine quality, far better than anything she had owned since childhood, and it made her feel almost presentable as she made her way to the kitchen for her first meal as a servant of Blackmore Hall. The kitchen was a warm, welcoming space with stone walls, copper pots hanging from iron hooks, and a great hearth where a fire crackled cheerfully. Mrs. Hartwell stood at a wooden table, slicing bread with practiced efficiency, while a thin man with weathered hands and kind blue eyes sat drinking tea from a chipped ceramic mug. Thomas Whitmore, the man introduced himself, rising with old-fashioned courtesy. Groundskeeper and general keeper of things that need keeping. His voice carried the accent of the northern valleys, and his smile was genuine. Welcome to our small to-spa family, Miss Thorne. As they shared a breakfast of fresh bread, butter, and preserved fruit, Ellyn learned more about the rhythms of Blackmore Hall. Lord Caelan indeed kept unusual hours, often sleeping until well past noon and walking the grounds until dawn. The house had its own peculiarities, doors that opened and closed on their own, candles that flickered without wind, and rooms that seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking. "The master is not like other gentlemen," Thomas said carefully, exchanging a meaningful glance with Mrs. Hartwell. "He has his ways, his reasons for things that might seem strange to outsiders. But he is fair, and he protects those under his care with a fierceness that would surprise many." After breakfast, Mrs. Hartwell began showing Ellyn her duties. They started in the grand hall, where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through stained glass windows. The windows depicted scenes from legend knights battling dragons, ladies walking through enchanted gardens, and in the center, a scene that made Ellyn pause in wonder. A dark-haired woman offering a cup to a pale man whose eyes seemed to hold the weight of eternity. "That window was commissioned by Lord Caelan's grandfather," Mrs. Hartwell explained, but something in her tone suggested the story was more complex than simple ancestral pride. "It tells the tale of a great love that conquered even death itself." As they worked, dusting furniture and polishing silver, Ellyn found herself drawn repeatedly to the family portraits that lined the walls. Each generation of Blackmores had the same striking features: the pale eyes, the aristocratic bearing, the sense of carrying some great burden. But it was always Lady Isabel's portrait that captured her attention most completely. By midday, they had moved to the upper floors. Mrs. Hartwell assigned Ellyn the task of cleaning and organizing a storage room filled with trunks and boxes that held the accumulated possessions of centuries. It was dusty, quiet work that allowed her mind to wander as her hands sorted through linens and old books, jewelry boxes, and forgotten treasures. It was while moving a particularly heavy trunk that disaster struck. The leather straps, weakened by age, snapped suddenly, sending the contents spilling across the floor in a cascade of fabric and metal. Ellyn gasped in dismay, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered items before Mrs. Hartwell could discover her clumsiness. Most of the trunk's contents were unremarkable: old clothes, letters tied with faded ribbon, books with pages yellowed by time. But as she reached under a fallen chair to retrieve the last of the scattered items, her fingers closed around something small and cold. When she drew it into the light, Her breath caught in her throat. It was a locket, no larger than her thumb, carved from what appeared to be moonstone. The surface was smooth as silk and seemed to glow with its own inner light, shifting from pale blue to silver as she turned it in her palm. The chain was delicate silver, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Intricate engravings covered the surface symbols that seemed almost like writing, though in no language she recognized. As her thumb traced the engravings, the locket opened with a soft click. Inside was a miniature portrait, a woman with dark hair and eyes, remarkably similar to Ellyn's own. But it was not the resemblance that made her gasp. It was the recognition that swept over her like a wave, the absolute certainty that she had seen this face before, not in any mirror, but in dreams that stretched back to her earliest memories. "This belonged to my grandmother," she whispered to the empty room, though she had no idea how she knew such a thing. Her grandmother had died before Ellyn's birth, leaving behind no possessions, no stories, nothing but a name half remembered by the foundling house matrons. The locket grew warm in her palm, and for a moment the storage room seemed to fade around her. She could smell roses and hear the distant sound of laughter, see glimpses of gardens in moonlight and a figure in a dark coat walking among shadows. The visions came and went like lightning, too quick to grasp, but leaving her shaken and strangely breathless. "Miss Thorne?" "Mrs." Hartwell's voice from the corridor broke the spell. "Is everything well?" "Yes," Ellyn called back, her voice only slightly unsteady. "Just a small accident with one of the trunks. Nothing damaged." She quickly fastened the chain around her neck, tucking the locket beneath her dress, where it lay against her heart like a second pulse. The warmth of it seemed to spread through her chest, bringing with it a strange sense of belonging, of finally finding something she had not even known she was missing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of mundane tasks, but Ellyn found it difficult to concentrate. The locket seemed to pulse against her skin, and twice she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that moved independent of any light source, whispers that might have been wind through the eaves or might have been something else entirely. It was near evening when she encountered Lord Caelan again. She was descending the main staircase, her arms full of fresh linens for the guest chambers, when he emerged from the library. He was dressed as he had been the night before, in dark clothes that emphasized his pale coloring and otherworldly bearing. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he had been running his fingers through it, and there was a tension in his posture that had not been there before. He looked up as she reached the bottom of the stairs, and their eyes met across the entrance hall. For a moment, neither moved. Then his gaze shifted, focusing on something at her throat with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. The locket had somehow worked its way free of her dress during her descent, and now it lay exposed against the white of her apron, catching the light from the chandelier and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. Lord Caelan went absolutely still. The colour drained from his already pale face, and his hand gripped the banister so tightly that Ellyn could hear the wood creak in protest. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough with an emotion she could not name. "Where did you find that?" The question hit her like a physical blow. There was pain in his voice, and recognition, and something that might have been hope, warring with despair. Ellyn's free hand moved instinctively to cover the locket, though she could not have said why. "In the storage room," she said softly. "It was in an old trunk. I believe it belonged to my grandmother." Lord Caelan moved toward her then, each step deliberate and controlled, like a man walking on ice that might shatter at any moment. When he reached her, he stopped, just beyond. Arm's length, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly before he clasped them behind his back. "May I see it?" he asked, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. Ellyn hesitated for a heartbeat, then slowly lifted the chain over her head. The moment the locket left contact with her skin, The warmth she had felt all afternoon vanished, leaving her feeling strangely bereft. She placed it carefully in Lord Caelan's outstretched palm, noting how his fingers closed around it as if it were infinitely precious. He stared down at the locket for a long moment, his thumb tracing the same engravings that Ellyn had touched. When he opened it to reveal the miniature portrait, a sound escaped him, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, but something that spoke of a pain so deep it had no adequate expression. "Isabel," he breathed, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "Dear God, it cannot be. My lord." Ellyn's, the voice was gentle, concerned. Whatever this meant to him, it clearly cut to the very core of his being. He looked up at her then, and in his pale eyes she saw something that made her heart race, recognition, wonder, and a love so fierce and desperate that it stole her breath. When he spoke, his words were chosen with the careful precision of a man who had learned that some truths were too dangerous to speak carelessly. "This locket," he said slowly, "belonged to someone I knew long ago, someone who meant everything to me and whom I lost to circumstances beyond my control." His gaze moved from the locket to her face, studying her features with an intensity that made her feel as if he were memorizing every detail. "You say it belonged to your grandmother?" "I believe so, though I know little of my family history. I was orphaned young and raised by the church." Ellyn paused, then added softly, "But when I touched it, I felt I saw things, fragments of memories that could not possibly be mine." Lord Caelan closed his eyes, and for a moment his composed mask slipped entirely, revealing a grief so profound that Ellyn wanted nothing more than to comfort him. When he opened them again, his expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the storm raging beneath the surface. "Keep it," he said, placing the locket back in her hands with infinite care. "It belongs with you now, as it always should have." His fingers brushed hers as he transferred the delicate chain, and Ellyn felt a shock of connection, as if something fundamental had just shifted between them. "My lord, Caelan," he said quietly. "My name is Caelan, and I begin to think that fate has finally decided to show mercy to a man who gave up hope of redemption long ago." He stepped back then, his formal composure sliding back into place like armor, but Ellyn could still see the change in him. The careful distance was still there, but underneath it was something new, a fragile, desperate hope that seemed to glow as softly as moonlight. "Return to your duties, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice once again the measured tone of a lord addressing his servant. "But know that Blackmore Hall holds more mysteries than you yet imagine, and that some stories that seem ended are merely waiting for the right moment to begin again." As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor, Ellyn fastened the locket around her neck once more. The warmth returned immediately, along with something else, a sense of destiny awakening, of wheels long stilled, beginning to turn once more. That night, her dreams were filled with moonlight and roses, with a love that had somehow transcended death itself, and with the growing certainty that her arrival at Blackmore Hall had been no accident at all. The days that followed the discovery of the locket passed in a strange haze of heightened awareness. Ellyn found herself acutely conscious of every sound in the great house, every shadow that moved across the walls, every moment when she might encounter Lord Caelan in the corridors. The locket had become a constant presence against her heart, warm and somehow reassuring, yet it also seemed to amplify her sensitivity to the supernatural currents that flowed through Blackmore Hall like underground rivers. She had established a routine of sorts, rising before dawn to help Mrs. Hartwell prepare breakfast, spending her mornings cleaning the common areas, and dedicating her afternoons to the endless task of maintaining a house that seemed to exist partially outside the normal flow of time. The mansion had its own rhythm, its own moods, and Ellyn was beginning to understand that she was not merely a servant here, but somehow a participant in a drama that had been unfolding for far longer than her lifetime. It was during her third week at Blackmore Hall that curiosity finally overcame caution. Lord Caelan had ridden out on his black stallion just after sunset, as was his custom, and Mrs. Hartwell had retired early with a headache that left Ellyn alone in the vast house, save for Thomas, who was tending to repairs in the stables. The silence that settled over the mansion was different from ordinary quiet. It felt expectant, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Ellyn had finished her evening tasks and was preparing to retire when she noticed a thin line of golden light beneath a door she had never seen opened. It was at the end of a corridor in the west wing, past Lord Caelan's private chambers, in a section of the house that Mrs. Hartwell had quietly indicated was off-limits to the household staff. The sensible thing would have been to ignore the light and return to her room, but the locket at her throat had grown warm, almost urgent, and she found her feet carrying her down the corridor as if guided by a will not entirely her own. The closer she came to the mysterious door, the stronger the pull became, until she stood before it, with her hand raised to knock. The door opened at her touch, swinging inward on silent hinges to reveal a sight that took her breath away. She stood at the threshold of a library that seemed to stretch impossibly far into the distance, its shelves reaching from floor to a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Thousands upon thousands of books lined the walls, leather-bound volumes, ancient scrolls, manuscripts that looked as if they had been written by the hand of time itself. The air smelled of old parchment and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that she could not quite identify. Candles burned in silver sconces throughout the room, their flames dancing without any wind to disturb them, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the endless rows of knowledge. Magnificent, isn't it? Ellyn spun around, her heart leaping to her throat. Lord Caelan stood just inside the doorway, having entered so silently that she had not heard his approach. He was still, dressed in his riding clothes, though she had not heard him return, and his pale eyes held an expression she could not read. "My lord, I'm sorry," she began, backing away from the shelves. "I saw the light and thought perhaps something was amiss." He stepped further into the room, moving with that peculiar grace that made no sound on the marble floor. "You were drawn here, weren't you? Called by something you cannot name." The directness of the question caught her off guard, as did the lack of anger in his voice. Instead of the scolding she expected, there was something almost like relief in his tone, as if her presence here confirmed something he had been hoping for. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I felt compelled to come, though I cannot say why." Lord Caelan nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "This library has been in my family for centuries. It contains knowledge that most of the world would consider impossible, dangerous, or both. Few can sense its presence, fewer still feel called to enter uninvited." His gaze moved to where the locket lay beneath her dress, its chain visible at her throat. "But then, you are not like most people, are you, Ellyn?" There was something in the way he said her name that made warmth spread through her chest, not the comfortable warmth of the locket, but something deeper and more unsettling. She found herself moving closer to him, despite every rational instinct telling her to maintain distance. "What kind of knowledge?" she asked, gesturing toward the endless shelves. "The kind that explains why shadows move without light to cast them. Why some houses remember the footsteps of those who lived within them centuries past. Why certain bloodlines carry gifts that science cannot explain and the church would rather ignore." He paused, beside a reading table, where an open book lay, its pages covered with text that seemed to shift and change even as she watched. Why a locket lost long ago would find its way to the one person destined to wear it. Ellyn approached the table, drawn by the strange manuscript, despite the voice of caution in her mind. The book was bound in midnight blue leather, its pages made of a material that was not quite parchment and not quite paper. But it was the text itself that made her gasp in wonder and horror. The words were written in deep, crimson ink that seemed to pulse with its own life. As she stared at the flowing script, the letters seemed to rearrange themselves, transforming from incomprehensible symbols into words she could understand, as if the very act of her reading was translating them from some ancient tongue. "This is written in blood," she breathed, though she could not have said how she knew such a thing. "My blood," Lord Caelan confirmed, his voice carefully controlled. "Written over the course of many years, chronicling things that conventional history chooses to forget, the existence of creatures that walk between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The ancient contracts that bind certain families to fates they never chose. The curses that can be passed down through generations like inherited jewels." Ellyn's eyes moved over the visible text, picking out fragments that made her pulse quicken. "The Blackmore lineage bears the mark of the eternal night, bound by choice and sacrifice to walk between worlds. Only through the willing love of a pure heart can the curse be broken." "What does it mean?" she whispered. Lord Caelan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he were searching for something specific in her expression. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "It means that some stories that appear to be endings are actually beginnings, that some curses carry within them the seeds of their own redemption, and that you, Ellyn Thorne, may be the answer to a prayer I offered up so long ago that I had forgotten I ever made it." Before she could respond, a sound echoed through the house, a howl that was not quite animal and not quite human, rising from somewhere in the distance and growing closer with each passing second. Lord Caelan's head snapped up, his expression instantly alert and dangerous. "We have visitors," he said grimly, moving to one of the library's tall windows and gazing out into the night. "Uninvited ones." Ellyn joined him at the window, peering out into the moonlit grounds. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and silver light. Then movement caught her eye, figures emerging from the forest that bordered the estate, moving with inhuman speed and purpose toward the mansion. "What are they?" she asked, though some deep instinct was already providing the answer. "Vampires," Lord Caelan replied simply, "and they have come for something they believe belongs to them." His hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers cold but strong. "Stay close to me, Ellyn. Tonight you will learn that the world contains far more wonders and terrors than you ever imagined. But know this, whatever happens, I will protect you. I swore such an oath once before, and I will not break it again." The howling grew closer, and with it came the sound of breaking glass from somewhere below. The siege of Blackmore Hall had begun. The attack came swift and merciless. Glass shattered in the lower floors as dark shapes poured through windows like smoke given form. Lord Caelan moved with inhuman speed, pressing a silver letter opener into Ellyn's hand while positioning himself between her and the library's entrance. "Whatever happens," he said urgently, "do not let them touch the locket, and if I fall, run to the rose garden. The roses will protect you until dawn." Before Ellyn could ask what he meant, the library doors burst open. 3 figures dressed in dark clothing entered with predatory grace, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light that made Ellyn's skin crawl. They moved like wolves, circling with patient menace, but their attention was focused entirely on Lord Caelan. "Marcus," Caelan said, his voice deadly calm as he addressed the tallest of the intruders. "Still traveling with rabble, I see." The vampire called Marcus stepped forward, and Ellyn could see that he had once been handsome before something had twisted his features into cruel beauty. His smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too white, and his voice carried the accent of old aristocracy corrupted by centuries of violence. "Dear cousin," Marcus purred, the familial address somehow more threatening than any curse. "How long has it been? 2 centuries? 3? Time moves so strangely when one has eternity to waste on brooding and self-pity." "Not long enough," Caelan replied. "State your business and leave my lands." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Your lands? How presumptuous. I've come to collect what rightfully belongs to our bloodline." The girl carries something that was never meant for mortal hands. Ellyn's free hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, and she saw Marcus's eyes follow the gesture with hungry satisfaction. "The locket belongs to her," Caelan said, his voice dropping to a growl that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the mansion. "As it belonged to her grandmother before her." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, beloved cousin." Marcus began to circle them like a shark scenting blood. "That particular artifact belongs to our family, created by our ancestors to bind mortals to our will. Its return to the bloodline it was meant to control is long overdue." The battle erupted without warning. Caelan moved like liquid lightning, striking one of Marcus's companions with force that sent the vampire crashing through a bookshelf. Ancient volumes scattered like leaves, their pages fluttering through the air as supernatural speed met supernatural strength in deadly combat. Ellyn pressed, herself against the far wall, clutching the silver letter opener as shadows and light blurred together in a dance of violence. She had never seen anything like the way the vampires fought too fast for human eyes to follow clearly, striking with enough force to shatter stone, moving with a grace that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. But even as she watched Caelan battle with skills honed over centuries, she could see that he was outnumbered. For every blow he landed, 2 came back in return. Blood darker than human blood, almost black in the candlelight, began to stain his white shirt. It was then that the locket at her throat grew suddenly, blazingly hot. Light burst from beneath her dress, silver-white radiance that made the attacking vampires shriek and recoil. The illumination seemed to strengthen Caelan while weakening his enemies, and he pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. "Impossible!" Marcus snarled, his perfect features twisted with rage and disbelief. "She's mortal. The locket should drain her life force, not enhance it. Some bloodlines carry gifts your kind never understood," Caelan replied, dispatching the second attacker with a move that left the vampire crumbling to ash on the marble floor. The thorn line was never meant to serve. They were meant to stand as equals. Marcus's eyes widened with understanding that was equal parts fury and calculation. "She's not just any descendant, is she?" "She's leave," Caelan commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made even the ancient vampire take a step backward. "While you still can." For a moment Marcus looked as if he might continue the fight, then his gaze moved from Caelan to Ellyn, studying her face with newfound interest. "This isn't over," he said finally. "The council will want to know about this development." "About her." His smile was all sharp edges and dark promise. "Enjoy your brief reunion, cousin. It won't last long." He melted into shadow and was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of blood and the feeling that something far more dangerous than a simple attack had just occurred. Lord Caelan swayed on his feet, the supernatural speed and strength leaving him all at once. Ellyn rushed to his side, noting the deep gashes across his chest and arms where claws had found their mark. "You're hurt," she said, reaching out to touch one of the wounds. "It will heal," he assured her, but his voice was strained. "Vampire wounds always heal, given time." The casual revelation should have shocked her more than it did. Instead, Ellyn found herself accepting this final piece of the puzzle with a strange sense of completion, as if she had always known the truth but had been waiting for permission to acknowledge it. "You're like them," she said softly, "but different." "I am what they made me," Caelan replied, "but not what they wanted me to become." He led her from the damaged library through corridors that seemed to repair themselves as they passed, until they emerged into the moonlit gardens behind the mansion. Here, the supernatural battle might never have occurred. Peace reigned among carefully tended pathways lined with roses that bloomed in impossible profusion. But these were not ordinary roses. In the moonlight, Ellyn could see that each bloom gave off its own soft luminescence, creating a garden of living stars. Silver roses twined with midnight blue, golden blooms nodded beside others that seemed to capture starlight within their petals. The enchanted rose garden, Caelan said, settling onto a stone bench beside a fountain whose waters sang with musical voices. Created by my ancestor as a sanctuary, no creature of darkness can enter here without permission, and no evil can take root in soil blessed by true love. Ellyn moved among the glowing roses, watching in wonder as they seemed to turn toward her like flowers, following the sun. When she reached out to touch one, it bloomed, larger and brighter, as if responding to her presence. "They recognize you," Caelan observed, his voice filled with an emotion she could not name. "As the locket recognizes you, as I recognized you the moment I saw you at my gates." She turned to face him, seeing him clearly for the first time, without the careful masks he wore. In the gentle light of the enchanted roses, she could see the weight of centuries in his pale eyes, the loneliness that had carved lines of sorrow into his ageless features. But she could also see hope, fragile and new, growing like the first flower of spring. "Tell me about her," Ellyn said softly. "About Isabel." Caelan was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words fell like autumn leaves in the still air. She was everything good in the world, kind, brave, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with her face. She saw past what I had become to what I had once been, and for a brief, shining moment, she made me remember what it felt like to be human. "What happened to her?" "She died," he said simply. "Vampires and mortals were never meant to love each other, Ellyn. The very nature of what we are makes such bonds impossible to sustain. She grew old while I remained unchanged, and in the end, time took what fangs and claws could not. But the locket was her promise that love could transcend even death, that somewhere, somehow, her spirit would find a way back to mine." His eyes met hers across the garden. "I have waited 3 centuries for that promise to be fulfilled." The weight of his words settled over her like a silken shroud. In the distance, she could hear Mrs. Hartwell calling her name, concern evident in the housekeeper's voice. Dawn was approaching, painting the eastern sky with the faintest blush of rose. "I should go," Ellyn said, though every instinct urged her to stay. "Yes," Caelan agreed, rising from the bench. "Marcus will return, and when he does, he will not come alone. The Vampire Council is not known for its patience with those who defy their will." As she turned to go, his voice stopped her. "Ellyn?" She looked back, and in that moment, surrounded by roses that glowed like captured starlight, she felt the first stirring of something deeper than attraction, stronger than curiosity. Something that might have been love, if she had been brave enough to name it. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "know that these weeks with you here have been the happiest I have known in 3 centuries. She walked back to the mansion as the roses dimmed with the approaching dawn, her heart full of questions and her mind spinning with possibilities. Behind her, Lord Caelan remained among his enchanted flowers, a figure of eternal solitude, learning to hope once more. The days following the attack passed in a tense calm that felt more ominous than peaceful. Lord Caelan had increased the supernatural protections around Blackmore Hall, and Ellyn could feel the difference in the air, a heaviness that spoke of ancient wards and protective spells woven into the very foundations of the estate. Mrs. Hartwell moved through her duties with unusual solemnity, and even Thomas seemed more watchful than usual as he tended the grounds. It was during this uneasy interlude that Mrs. Hartwell approached Ellyn with a request that seemed simple on its surface, but carried undertones of deeper significance. "There is a chamber beneath the mansion," the housekeeper said as they worked together in the kitchen, her voice carefully neutral. "The family vault. Lord Caelan has asked that it be cleaned and organized, and he specifically requested that you be the one to tend to it." Ellyn looked up from the silver she was polishing, noting the way Mrs. Hartwell's hands trembled slightly as she kneaded bread dough. "Is something wrong? You seem troubled." The older woman paused in her work, her kind eyes meeting Ellyn's with an expression of maternal concern mixed with something that might have been fear. "Child, there are things in this house, in this family, that run deeper than you know. Lord Caelan is a good man, but he carries burdens that would break lesser souls. The vault contains artifacts and memories that have shaped the Blackmore line for centuries." She reached across to touch Ellyn's hand gently. "Be careful what you touch, what you awaken. Some sleeping things are better left undisturbed." The entrance to the vault lay hidden behind a tapestry in the library, revealed by pressing a specific combination of carved roses in the wooden paneling. As the concealed door swung open, cool air rushed out, carrying the scent of old stone and something else, metal and leather, and the faint trace of herbs that had been used long ago for preservation. Ellyn descended the narrow stone steps with an oil lamp in one hand and cleaning supplies in the other, the locket at her throat growing warm as she moved deeper into Pata, the earth beneath Blackmore Hall. The stairs ended in a circular chamber with walls lined with alcoves and shelves, each containing artifacts that spoke of centuries of accumulated history. There were books here even older than those in the library above, their leather bindings cracked with age but still intact. Ornate jewelry rested in wooden boxes lined with faded silk. Ancient weapons hung on iron pegs, swords whose blades still gleamed despite their age, crossbows carved with protective symbols, and shields bearing the Blackmore coat of arms. But it was the altar-like stone table in the center of the chamber that drew her attention immediately. Upon it lay a single object, wrapped in midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lamplight. Even from across the room, Ellyn could feel power radiating from whatever lay beneath the cloth, an energy that made the locket pulse against her heart in warning. She approached the table slowly, each step echoing in the tessered, vaulted chamber. When she reached for the silk wrapping, her fingers hesitated, Mrs. Hartwell's warnings echoing in her mind. Then curiosity overcame caution, and she drew back the cloth to reveal what lay beneath. It was a dagger, but unlike any weapon she had ever seen. The blade was forged from silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own light, and etched along its length were symbols that matched those on her locket. The handle was carved from what appeared to be white bone, inlaid with more silver in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Despite its obvious age, the weapon looked as if it had been forged yesterday. The moment her fingers touched the handle, the chamber exploded into brilliant silver light. Visions flooded her mind with the force of a breaking dam, images of battles fought in moonlight, of figures in dark robes, wielding similar weapons against creatures of shadow and blood. She saw the dagger in hands that looked like her own, heard voices speaking in the ancient language she had seen in Caelan's blood-written manuscript. "The silver dagger of House Blackmore," a voice said behind her, and Ellyn spun to find Lord Caelan standing at the foot of the stairs, his pale eyes reflecting the supernatural radiance still emanating from the weapon. "I wondered how long it would take to call to you." "I don't understand," Ellyn said, though even as she spoke, fragments of understanding were beginning to coalesce in her mind. "The visions, I saw people who looked like me, fighting vampires," Caelan finished quietly. "The Thorn bloodline were not merely mortals, Ellyn. They were vampire hunters, blessed by ancient magic and trained from birth to stand against the creatures of the night. The dagger you hold was forged specifically for that purpose, quenched in holy water and blessed by saints whose names have been forgotten by history. The weapon felt both foreign and familiar in her hands, as if it were something she had been meant to wield, but had never quite known she was missing. But if my family were vampire hunters, why didn't I know? Why was I raised in ignorance? Caelan moved closer, his expression unreadable. Because the last of the hunter bloodlines made a choice 3 centuries ago. Your ancestor Isabel chose love over duty, peace over war. She laid down her weapons and accepted transformation, believing that understanding could bridge the gap between our kinds. The revelation hit Ellyn like a physical blow. Isabel was my ancestor. She was a vampire hunter. She was the greatest of her generation, Caelan said softly. Skilled, fearless, dedicated to protecting the innocent from creatures like me. The council sent her to Blackmore Hall to destroy me, believing that a young hunter could succeed where their armies had failed. What happened? She fell in love with the monster she was meant to kill. His voice carried centuries of pain and self-recrimination. And I, fool that I, fell in love with her in return. The very bond that should have been our salvation became the source of our doom. Ellyn looked down at the silver dagger, understanding now why it felt so right in her hands, why the locket had grown warm when she first touched it, why the roses in the garden had responded to her presence. She was not merely Ellyn Thorne, homeless servant girl. She was the last descendant of a line of warriors, carrying in her blood the power to stand against the supernatural forces that threatened the mortal world. The vampire who attacked us, she said slowly. Marcus, he knew what I was, didn't he? He suspected, Caelan confirmed, but seeing you wield the locket's power confirmed his fears. A hunter's descendant who can channel supernatural energy without being consumed by it, you represent something the Vampire Council has worked for centuries to prevent. What do they want with me? Caelan's expression grew grim. To corrupt you, as they believe I corrupted Isabel. To turn your hunter's gifts to their purposes and break the last connection between your bloodline and its sacred duty. Or, if corruption fails, to destroy me, Ellyn finished, the truth settling over her like a cold shroud. Yes. She looked around the vault, seeing it now not as a repository of curious artifacts, but as an armory, a place where weapons of supernatural power waited for the hands trained to wield them. The silver dagger pulsed with energy that seemed to respond to her heartbeat, and she could feel other objects in the chamber awakening to her presence, a silver-chased crossbow, a shield inscribed with protective wards, arrows whose points gleamed with more than mere metal. "Teach me," she said suddenly, her voice ringing with determination that surprised even herself. "If I am the last of the hunters, if my blood carries this responsibility, then I need to know how to use these gifts properly." Caelan studied her face for a long moment, and she could see the war raging behind his pale eyes, the desire to protect her, warring with the recognition that knowledge might be her only true defense. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Once you walk this path, there will be no returning to the innocence you knew before. You will see the world as it truly is, with all its hidden darkness and terrible beauty. You will carry the weight of knowing that creatures of nightmare walk among mortals, and that sometimes you may be the only thing standing between them and innocent blood." Ellyn thought of Marcus's cruel smile, of the way his companions had moved through the mansion like predators stalking prey. She thought of Mrs. Hartwell's worried face, of Thomas's quiet vigilance, of all the ordinary people in the world who lived their lives unaware of the supernatural forces that surrounded them. "I'm certain," she said, her grip tightening on the silver dagger. "Show me how to be what my ancestors were. Show me how to protect those who cannot protect themselves." A ghost of a smile touched Caelan's lips, the first genuine expression of joy she had seen from him since the night in the rose garden. "Then we begin at dawn," he said, "and may God help us both for what we are about to unleash." As they climbed the stairs from the vault, leaving the chamber of ancient weapons behind them, Ellyn felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak. The frightened servant girl who had collapsed at the gates of Blackmore Hall was gone forever, replaced by something new and dangerous and filled with purpose. The last of the vampire hunters had awakened, and the supernatural world would never be the same. The training began before dawn in the mansion's hidden armory, a chamber adjacent to the vault that Ellyn had not noticed during her first visit. Under Caelan's patient guidance, she learned to channel the power that flowed through her bloodline, to move with the fluid grace that had made her. Ancestors legendary among both mortals and vampires. The silver dagger responded to her touch like a living thing, its weight perfectly balanced in her hand as if it had been forged specifically for her grip. When she moved through the combat forms Caelan taught her, silver light trailed from the blade, creating patterns in the air that seemed to burn themselves into her memory. "Your ancestors were not merely warriors," Caelan explained as they practiced in the pre-dawn darkness. "They were artists of combat, dancers with death itself. The silver weapons channel not just their wielder's strength, but their will, their purpose, their absolute conviction in the righteousness of their cause." As the days passed, Ellyn found herself changing in ways that went beyond mere physical training. Her senses sharpened until she could hear conversations from rooms away, could smell the approach of rain hours before the first clouds appeared. The locket at her throat had become a constant source of warmth, and sometimes, in the corner of her vision, she caught glimpses of figures that were not quite there, shadows of ancestors long dead, offering silent guidance. It was during the second week of her training that Mrs. Hartwell approached her with a discovery that would change everything once again. "I found something while cleaning the upper chambers," the housekeeper said, her voice tight with worry. "Something that's been hidden away for decades, perhaps centuries." She led Ellyn to a small chamber in the mansion's highest tower, a room that had clearly been sealed for many years. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through windows that looked out over the entire estate, and in the center of the circular space stood a pedestal holding an object that made Ellyn's breath catch. The crystal scrying mirror was a perfect circle of obsidian dark glass set in a frame of tarnished silver. Unlike an ordinary mirror, its surface seemed to hold depth, as if one were looking not at a reflection, but into dark water that descended far below the visible surface. Ancient symbols were etched around the frame, and as Ellyn approached, they began to glow with the same silver light that emanated from her dagger. "Lord Caelan's grandmother was said to have the sight," Mrs. Hartwell explained quietly. She could see glimpses of what was to come, threads of possibility that wove themselves into the pattern of destiny. This mirror was her tool, though it's been covered and forgotten since her death. Ellyn felt drawn to the artifact as she had been drawn to the locket, to the dagger, to everything else in this house that seemed to recognize something in her blood. When she reached out to touch the mirror's surface, Mrs. Hartwell caught her wrist gently. "Be careful, child. The future is not always kind to those who seek to know it before its time." But the pull was irresistible. The moment Ellyn's fingers made contact with the dark glass, the chamber around her dissolved into swirling mist and shadow. She found herself standing in a place that was not quite real, surrounded by images that flickered and shifted like candlelight caught in a draught. The first vision struck her like lightning. She saw herself standing in the rose garden, but it was ablaze with silver fire that reached toward the star-filled sky. Caelan knelt before her, his pale eyes reflecting her radiance as she placed her hands upon his shoulders. Where she touched, the curse marks that bound him began to fade, centuries of supernatural bondage dissolving under the power of love freely given. But even as that vision brought hope, it was replaced by another that chilled her to the bone. She saw the vampire council in all its terrible glory, dozens of ancient creatures gathered in a stone amphitheatre that reeked of age and evil. Marcus stood before them, his voice carrying clearly through the vision as he spoke of the hunter's descendant who threatened their carefully maintained order. The eldest of them, a figure so pale and gaunt he seemed carved from bone, pronounced a sentence that made the assembled vampires roar with approval. The scene shifted again, and she saw herself fleeing through a forest that burned with unnatural fire, the silver dagger clutched in her hands as creatures of shadow pursued her with relentless hunger. Behind her, Blackmore Hall lay in ruins, its windows dark and empty, its gardens withered and dead. Then came perhaps the most disturbing vision of all. Herself, but changed, her eyes glowing with the terrible light of the vampire curse. She stood beside Marcus in a place of darkness, wearing a gown of midnight silk, the silver dagger transformed into a weapon of corruption. When she spoke, her voice carried the cruel beauty of the damned, and she laughed as mortal villages burned in the distance. "No," Ellyn gasped, trying to pull away from the mirror's surface. But the visions continued, each more terrible or more wonderful than the last. She saw herself and Caelan united in a bond that transcended death itself, saw them standing as guardians between the mortal and supernatural worlds. She saw herself dying in his arms, the locket's power finally exhausted. She saw him walking away from Blackmore Hall forever, leaving her behind to live a mortal life, free from the burden of his curse. The final vision was the strangest of all. She stood in a place of perfect balance, surrounded by representatives of both vampire and hunter bloodlines. In her hands was not the silver dagger, but something new, a weapon that gleamed with both silver and shadow, light and darkness perfectly merged. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of one who had chosen to stand not with either side, but for something greater than both. The mirror's surface went dark, and Ellyn found herself back in the tower chamber, gasping and shaking. Mrs. Hartwell was beside her immediately, steadying her. With gentle hands, "What did you see, child?" "Too much," Ellyn whispered, her mind still reeling from the cascade of possibilities. "The future is not one path, but many, and some of them lead to darkness beyond imagining." That evening, she found Caelan in the library, studying maps that showed the locations of vampire strongholds throughout Europe. When she told him about the mirror and its revelations, he listened with the stillness that she had learned meant he was processing information that could reshape his understanding of the world. "The Council moves faster than I anticipated," he said finally. "Marcus has convinced them that you represent a threat that must be eliminated before you fully come into your power." "Some of the visions showed us together," Ellyn said carefully. "United against them, but others," she shuddered, remembering the image of herself transformed into something monstrous. "The future is not fixed," Caelan replied, rising from his chair to pace. "Before the window. Every choice we make creates new possibilities, closes off others. The mirror shows potential paths, not inevitable destinations. But it also showed something else," Ellyn continued. "A weapon that was neither purely light nor purely dark, but something in between. A way to bridge the gap between our kinds without destroying either." Caelan stopped pacing, his pale eyes fixed on her face. "You're speaking of the old prophecies. The legends say that when the last hunter and the last noble vampire unite in true love, a new age will dawn, one where our kinds can exist in balance rather than eternal war. Do you believe it's possible?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. When he spoke, his voice carried a hope so fragile it might shatter at a touch. 3 weeks ago, I would have said no. I had given up on prophecies and legends, convinced that some curses are too deep to break, some rifts too wide to bridge. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his pale eyes. "But you have awakened things in me I thought dead forever. You have shown me that redemption might be possible even for creatures like me. And if the council comes for us before we're ready, then we fight, he said simply. And we hope that love proves stronger than the darkness that created us both. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and in the distance came the sound of wolves howling, or perhaps something that only resembled wolves. The future remained unwritten, balanced on the edge of a knife that could cut toward salvation or damnation with equal ease. But for now, in this moment, hope burned bright between them like a candle in the darkness, and that was enough to keep the shadows at bay. The Vampire Council arrived at Blackmoor Hall on the night of the new moon, when darkness lay thick across the land like a shroud. They came not as raiders or warriors, but as judges, bearing the weight of centuries and the authority to reshape the supernatural world with a single decree. Ellyn felt their approach long before their dark carriages crested the hill beyond the estate gates. The locket at her throat grew cold instead of warm, and every protective ward around the mansion began to sing with tension. The silver dagger at her side hummed like a tuning fork, resonating with power that made her fingertips tingle. "They come in numbers I did not expect," Caelan said grimly as they watched from the library windows. Below, a procession of black carriages, drawn by horses, whose eyes glowed like coals, wound its way up the drive toward the mansion. The entire High Council, by the look of it. This is no mere investigation. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "The great hall has been prepared as you requested, my lord. Thomas has withdrawn to the village for his own safety." She looked at Ellyn with maternal concern. "Perhaps Miss Thorne should join him." "No," Ellyn said firmly, her hand moving to the silver dagger's hilt. "Whatever happens tonight, we face it together." The council entered Blackmoor Hall with the ceremony of ancient royalty. They were creatures of terrible beauty, each one bearing the marks of centuries spent in supernatural existence. Their leader was the figure Ellyn had seen in the scrying mirror, gaunt and pale as bleached bone, with eyes that held the weight of empires risen and fallen. He introduced himself as Lord Voldris, first speaker of the council, and his voice carried the authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience. "Caelan of House Blackmoor," Valdris intoned as the assembled vampires took their places in the great hall like judges at a tribunal. "You stand accused of harboring a hunter descendant, of teaching her forbidden arts, and of forming an attachment that threatens the natural order between our kinds." Marcus stood at Valdris's right hand, his cruel smile. "A promise of vengeance long delayed. The evidence is clear, my lord. She bears the locket of binding, wields the silver weapons of her bloodline, and has awakened powers that should have died with her ancestors." "I deny nothing," Caelan replied, his voice steady despite the overwhelming presence arrayed against him. "Ellyn Thorne is under my protection, and I will not surrender her to your judgment." Valdris smiled, an expression that held no warmth. How touching, and how foolish. He gestured to one of his companions, who stepped forward bearing an ornate silver chalice that made every supernatural sense Ellyn possessed scream in warning. The binding chalice was a thing of terrible beauty, wrought from precious metals and set with gems that seemed to hold captured starlight. But it was the symbols carved into its surface that made Ellyn's blood run cold. The same ancient script that appeared in Caelan's blood-written manuscript, the same markings that adorned the silver dagger and the locket at her throat. "Do you know what this is, Hunter's child?" Valdris asked, his attention shifting to Ellyn with predatory focus. "A weapon," she replied, though she could not have said how she knew. "More than a weapon. It is a choice." Valdris held the chalice aloft, and the gems set into its surface began to glow with inner fire. This artifact was created in the early days, when the war between our kinds was young and the outcome still uncertain. It holds within it two possibilities, two paths that lead to very different futures. The vampire lord's gaze bored into Ellyn's with uncomfortable intensity. The first path. You drink from this chalice willingly, and every vampire in existence is banished from the mortal world forever. The barriers between our realms become absolute, unbreachable. Your kind wins the eternal war that has raged for millennia. Murmurs ran through the assembled council, but Valdris raised a hand for silence. The second path. You bind yourself to one of our number through the ancient ritual of mating, accepting transformation and joining our ranks forever. In doing so, you break the hunter bloodline's power permanently, ensuring that mortals will never again pose a threat to vampire kind. Those are not choices, Caelan snarled, moving protectively closer to Ellyn. They are ultimatums designed to destroy her either way. Are they? Marcus stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Ellyn with calculating interest. Consider the first option more carefully, dear cousin. She saves all of mortal humanity from our influence, but at what cost? Every vampire, including yourself, cast into the void forever. No chance for redemption, no possibility of the balance your precious prophecies speak of. Valdris nodded approvingly. And the second option preserves the possibility of coexistence, but requires personal sacrifice. She becomes one of us, yes, but she does so willingly, in full knowledge of what she gains and loses. What I gain, Ellyn found her voice at last, though it shook with anger and disbelief. You speak as if corruption were a gift. Is it not? Valdris moved closer, his presence a cold weight in the air. Immortality. Power beyond mortal comprehension, the ability to shape the world according to your will. Your ancestor Isabel would have made this choice gladly, had she been offered it. My ancestor chose love over power, Ellyn replied firmly. She chose understanding over domination. And where did that choice lead? Marcus interjected. To her death. To the dissolution of the hunter bloodlines, to generations of her descendants living in ignorance of their true heritage. Her choice accomplished nothing, save temporary peace for one brief human lifetime. It was then that Valdris revealed the true depth of the trap they had laid. But perhaps we have not been entirely forthcoming about the nature of these choices, he said, his smile growing even more predatory. You see, child, the chalice responds only to blood freely given. If you choose the first path, the banishment of all vampires, the ritual requires not just your death, but the willing sacrifice of the vampire you love most. Ellyn's heart stopped. What? The binding between hunter and vampire that your ancestors forged in the early days runs deeper than mere sentiment. To break it completely, to sever all connections between our kinds forever, requires that connection to be severed at its strongest point. Valdris's eyes moved meaningfully between Ellyn and Caelan. He would have to willingly drink from the chalice first, accepting oblivion for the sake of your cause. The chamber fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the ancient stones. Ellyn felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if everything she thought she understood about the choice before her had been revealed as illusion. And if I choose transformation? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Then the bond between hunter and vampire becomes permanent, unbreakable. You would indeed become immortal, powerful, free from the limitations of mortal existence. But Valdris paused for effect. The ritual requires that you bind yourself not to any vampire, but to one chosen by the council, one whose loyalty to our kind is unquestionable. Marcus stepped forward with a bow that was mockery disguised as courtesy. I would be honored to serve as your mate, Lady Ellyn. Together, we could rule over a new age where vampires and mortals exist in proper hierarchy, with your kind serving ours as nature intended. Never, Caelan growled. Fangs extending as supernatural power filled the air around him. Ah, but that is where the true beauty of this choice reveals itself, Valdris said, clearly relishing the moment. If she refuses both options, then we simply eliminate the threat she represents by more direct means. But the consequences extend beyond her death. Every mortal who has been touched by hunter magic, Mrs. Hartwell, the groundskeeper Thomas, every villager within 10 miles of this estate dies with her. The hunter bloodline ends, but so do dozens of innocent lives. Ellyn felt the walls of the trap closing around her like the jaws of some enormous beast. Every path forward led to loss, to sacrifice, to the destruction of something precious. The chalice in Valdris's hands seemed to pulse with malevolent life, waiting for her decision. "How long do I have to choose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Until dawn," Valdris replied. "When the sun rises, one way or another, this matter will be resolved. The age of uncertainty ends with the coming light." As the council withdrew to wait for her decision, leaving Ellyn and Caelan alone in the great hall, the weight of impossible choices settled around them like a funeral shroud. Outside, storm clouds gathered with supernatural speed, and the wind began to howl through the eaves of Blackmoor. Hall like the voices of the damned. The final game had begun, and the stakes were nothing less than the fate of both their worlds. The hours until dawn stretched before them like an eternity of anguish. Ellyn and Caelan retreated to the library, where the familiar presence of ancient books and the lingering scent of parchment provided small comfort against the enormity of the choice that awaited her. The Vampire Council had taken residence in the mansion's guest wing, their presence a cold weight that pressed against every protective ward Caelan had woven around his ancestral home. "There has to be another way," Ellyn said for the 10th time, pacing before the great windows that looked out over gardens now shrouded in supernatural darkness. "The Council speaks as if these are the only possibilities, but prophecies and ancient magic are rarely so absolute." Caelan sat at his writing desk, surrounded by maps and manuscripts that chronicled centuries of supernatural lore. His pale hands moved among the documents with growing desperation, searching for some precedent, some forgotten ritual or overlooked clause that might offer a third path. "The binding rituals are older than written history," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of accumulated knowledge. "They were created in the early days when the war between our kinds threatened to consume both mortal and supernatural worlds. The magic involved is primal, absolute. It recognizes only clear choices, decisive action." It was Mrs. Hartwell who interrupted their desperate planning, appearing in the doorway with tea and a wooden box that Ellyn had never seen before. The housekeeper's usual composure was strained, but her eyes held a determination that spoke of decisions made and accepted. "Forgive me, my lord," she said, setting the tea service on a side table before approaching with the mysterious box. "But there is something I should have shared long ago, something that may change everything." The box was old, its wood darkened by centuries, and carved with symbols that made Ellyn's locket pulse with recognition. When Mrs. Hartwell opened it, golden light spilled out like captured sunlight, revealing a pendant that took Ellyn's breath away. The phoenix feather pendant was impossibly beautiful, a single feather wrought from what appeared to be pure gold, but which shimmered and shifted as if it held living fire within its delicate structure. It hung from a chain of silver links, so fine they seemed like captured starlight, and when Mrs. Hartwell lifted it from its resting place, the very air around it seemed to hum with power. "This belonged to all the women of your bloodline," Mrs. Hartwell said softly, her gaze fixed on Ellyn's face. "From the first hunter to take up arms against the darkness, down through the generations to your grandmother, Isabel herself." "You've had this all along?" Caelan asked, rising from his chair with supernatural grace. "Why did you not speak of it before?" Mrs. Hartwell's smile held secrets and sorrow in equal measure. "Because it was not yet time, my lord. The pendant chooses its moments, its revelations. It has been waiting for this night, this choice, this moment when all seemed lost." She placed the pendant in Ellyn's hands, and immediately the golden feather began to glow with inner fire that complemented rather than competed with the silver radiance of the locket. Where the two artifacts touched, sparks of light danced in the air, creating patterns that spoke to something deeper than conscious understanding. "What does it do?" Ellyn asked. Though even as she spoke, knowledge was flowing into her mind like water into a dry well. Images flashed before her eyes, women who looked like her wearing both locket and pendant, standing at crossroads of history where their choices shaped the fate of nations. She saw Isabel herself in the final moments before her transformation, both artifacts blazing with power as she made the choice that would echo through the centuries. "It represents renewal," Mrs. Hartwell explained, her voice taking on the cadence of ritual, of knowledge passed down through generations. "The phoenix dies in flame, only to be reborn from its own ashes. The pendant holds that power, the ability to transform endings into beginnings, to find life in the heart of death itself." Caelan moved closer, studying the pendant with growing wonder. The prophecies speak of three artifacts that must be united when the last hunter faces the ultimate choice. The silver dagger of justice, the moonstone locket of binding, and the phoenix feather of renewal. Ellyn finished, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. They were never meant to be used separately. Together, they form something greater than the sum of their parts. "But what does that mean for the choice the Council has forced upon us?" Caelan asked. "The chalice still holds its power. The chalice ultimatum still stands." Mrs. Hartwell moved to one of the library's ancient tomes, opening it to a page that seemed to have been waiting for this moment. The text was written in the same blood-red ink as Caelan's chronicle, but the hand was different, feminine, flowing, filled with quiet strength. "Isabel wrote this," Mrs. Hartwell said simply. "In the days before her transformation, when she realized that her choice would echo through the centuries. She foresaw this night, this moment when her descendant would face the same impossible decision she had confronted." Ellyn read the ancient words aloud, her voice growing stronger as the true meaning became clear. "When the last daughter of my line stands before the binding cup, let her know that love transforms all things, that sacrifice freely given breaks all chains. The three gifts of our bloodline, united in purpose and powered by willing hearts, can forge a new path where none existed before." She found a third option. Caelan breathed, wonder and hope warring in his pale eyes. A way to transform the very nature of the choice itself. But even as hope bloomed between them, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors. Marcus appeared in the library doorway, his cruel smile broader than ever as he took in the scene before him. "How touching," he purred, moving into the room with predatory grace. The doomed lovers discover hope at the last moment. Unfortunately, Lord Valdris has grown impatient. Dawn approaches faster than anticipated, and the Council demands your answer now. Behind him came other vampires, their combined presence filling the library with oppressive darkness that made the candle flames flicker and dance. Ellyn felt their power pressing against her like a weight, testing the strength of her resolve and the artifacts that protected her. "We need more time," Caelan said, moving to stand between Ellyn and the gathered vampires. "Time is a luxury. The Council no longer chooses to provide," Marcus replied. "Too long have we allowed sentiment to stay our hand. Too long have we permitted this dangerous bloodline to threaten our supremacy. The choice will be made now, in this moment, or we will make it for her." It was then that Valdris himself entered, the binding chalice cradled in his skeletal hands like a promise of doom. The artifact's gems pulsed with malevolent light that seemed to drain warmth from the very air, and when the vampire lord spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Ellyn Thorne, last daughter of the Hunter bloodline, the time for deliberation has ended." Choose now banishment for all our kind at the cost of your beloved's life, transformation and binding to one of our choosing, or death for you and all who bear even the faintest trace of hunter magic. Ellyn looked around the library that had become her sanctuary, at the books that held centuries of accumulated wisdom, at Mrs. Hartwell, whose maternal love had sustained her through these revelations, at Caelan, whose presence had awakened something in her heart she had never known she was missing. The phoenix feather pendant grew warm in her hands, its golden fire reflecting the hope that burned in her chest despite the overwhelming odds. "I choose," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself, "to forge a new path." She fastened the pendant around her neck, letting it rest beside the moonstone locket, while drawing the silver dagger with her right hand. The three artifacts began to resonate with harmonious power, their combined radiance growing until the very air around Ellyn shimmered with supernatural energy. "Impossible," Valdris hissed, his composed mask slipping for the first time. "The chalice recognizes only the choices bound within it. You cannot simply refuse to participate." "Can't I?" Ellyn asked, stepping forward with confidence born of absolute conviction. "My ancestor foresaw this moment, planned for it, left tools that could transform the very nature of your trap. The binding magic you've relied upon for centuries was created by hunters and vampires working together. It can be unmade by the same cooperation." Caelan moved to her side, his own supernatural power beginning to manifest as understanding dawned in his pale eyes. "The prophecy speaks of unity, of balance between light and darkness, not the domination of one over the other, but true partnership." "What are you proposing?" Marcus demanded, though uncertainty had crept into his voice for the first time. "A new covenant," Ellyn replied, the three artifacts blazing with power that made even the ancient vampires step back in alarm. "A binding not of dominance, but of mutual protection. A treaty sealed not in blood and death, but in love and willing sacrifice." Valdris raised the chalice, its dark power straining against the golden light that surrounded Ellyn. "The council will not be denied, if you will not choose." Then his words were cut off as the very foundations of Blackmore Hall began to resonate with power. The protective wards that Caelan had woven around his home awakened to full strength, recognizing in Ellyn's transformed presence something they had been designed to serve. Ancient magic that had slumbered for centuries began to stir, responding to the call of artifacts united and purpose clarified. "The hall itself remembers," Mrs. Hartwell said softly, wonder filling her voice. "It remembers the covenant that built it, the love that blessed its stones, the hope that its first master carried when he chose redemption over revenge." Outside, dawn was truly beginning to break, sending the first rays of sunlight through the library windows. But this was no ordinary sunrise. The light itself seemed touched with gold and silver, reflecting the power that flowed through the three artifacts and the woman who bore them. The final confrontation was upon them, and with presented the chance to transform not just their own fate, but the destiny of both their peoples forever. The moment Ellyn declared her intention to forge a new path, the ancient entity that had been stirring in the shadows of the supernatural world fully manifested. The library windows exploded inward as something vast and formless pressed against the protective barriers around Blackmore Hall, seeking entry with a hunger that had grown over millennia of patient waiting. The temperature in the room plummeted until their breath came out in visible clouds, and shadows that moved independent of any light source began creeping along the walls like living things. The very air became thick and oppressive, charged with malevolent energy that made every supernatural sense scream warnings of danger beyond comprehension. "What is that?" Marcus gasped, his vampiric composure finally cracking as he stared at the writhing darkness beyond the broken windows. "The true enemy," Valdris said grimly, the dark binding chalice trembling in his skeletal hands. the force that has manipulated both our kinds for centuries, feeding on the conflict between hunter and vampire, growing stronger with every drop of blood spilled in our eternal war. The entity spoke then, its voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the weight of eons and the promise of endings beyond death itself. "So long have I waited for this moment," it hissed through the broken windows, through the cracks in the stone walls, through the very air they breathed. "So long have I fed on your hatred, your fear, your endless cycle of violence and revenge. And now, when my feast should reach its crescendo, you dare speak of peace." Ellyn felt the three artifacts responding to the entity's presence, their combined power flaring like a beacon against the encroaching darkness. The phoenix feather pendant grew so bright it seemed like a small sun against her throat, while the moonstone locket pulsed with silver radiance that pushed back the creeping shadows. But it was the silver dagger in her hand that underwent the most dramatic transformation. The blade began to glow with inner fire that was neither purely silver nor purely gold, but something new, a fusion of light and warmth that spoke of love willingly given and sacrifice freely chosen. As she watched in wonder, the metal itself began to change, becoming translucent as crystal while retaining its strength. Runes appeared along its length, writing themselves in characters that seemed to burn with their own light. The soulfire blade, Missus. Hartwell breathed, recognition dawning in her eyes. The prophecy speaks of it a weapon, forged not in hatred, but in love, capable of cutting through the lies that divide our kinds. The ancient entity's rage pressed against the mansion's defenses like a physical weight, and several of the vampires staggered under the assault. But rather than unite them against this common threat, the council members began turning on each other, their carefully maintained alliances cracking under the pressure of primal fear. "This is your fault, Valdris," one of the council members snarled, fangs extending as supernatural instincts overrode centuries of civilized behavior. "Your obsession with the hunter bloodline has awakened something that should have remained dormant forever." "We must flee," another cried, moving toward the ruined windows, despite the writhing darkness beyond. "Gather our strength, regroup, face this threat when we are better prepared." "There is nowhere to run," Caelan said, his voice cutting through their panic with quiet authority. "That entity has been manipulating events for longer than any of us have existed. It feeds on conflict between our kinds, grows stronger with every act of violence we commit against each other. Flight will only delay the inevitable." It was then that Marcus stepped forward, his expression transformed from cruel amusement to something approaching genuine remorse. "I have served the council faithfully for centuries," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "But I will not serve a force that seeks the destruction of all supernatural kind." He knelt before Ellyn, his pale eyes meeting hers with an intensity that spoke of profound realization. "I offer myself as ally, not enemy. My knowledge, my power, my centuries of experience all at your disposal, if you can truly forge the path of which you speak." The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled vampires, but it also seemed to strengthen the protective barriers around the mansion. The entity's whispers grew more urgent, more desperate, as if it sensed the tide beginning to turn against it. "Traitors, all of you," Valdris spat, raising the binding chalice like a weapon. "I will not see centuries of vampire supremacy destroyed by sentiment and foolish hope." But even as he spoke, cracks began appearing in the chalice's surface, spreading outward from the gems that had once held its power. The artifact that had seemed so formidable was beginning to fail, its authority undermined by the growing unity between those who had once been enemies. Ellyn felt power flowing through her, unlike anything she had ever experienced. The soulfire blade in her hand pulsed with energy that seemed to come not just from the three artifacts, but from every act of courage and love in the mansion's long history. She could sense Caelan's presence beside her like a warm flame, could feel Mrs. Hartwell's maternal strength supporting her, could even sense the confused but genuine desire for redemption emanating from Marcus. "Stand with me," she called to the vampires still loyal to the council, her voice carrying authority born not of dominance but of hope offered freely. "Help me forge a new covenant between our peoples. Help me prove that love is stronger than the hatred that has divided us for too long." The entity's rage reached a crescendo, pressing against the mansion's defenses with force that made the ancient stones groan in protest. Several more windows shattered, and shadows began pouring through the gaps like smoke given malevolent form. The final battle for the soul of both species had begun. The battle reached its crescendo as the ancient entity finally breached the mansion's defenses, pouring through the broken windows like liquid darkness given form. It moved with terrible purpose, seeking to corrupt the growing unity between vampire and hunter, to twist their newfound alliance into the very hatred and violence that had sustained it for millennia. Ellyn raised the soulfire blade, its transformed radiance cutting through the encroaching shadows like a beacon of hope. Where its light touched the entity's darkness, the malevolent force recoiled with sounds that were not quite screams and not quite the tearing of reality itself. But even as she fought, she could feel the creature's insidious influence working at the edges of her consciousness, whispering doubts and fears designed to shatter her resolve. "You cannot win," it hissed in voices that belonged to every person she had ever lost, every moment of despair she had ever experienced. "Love is temporary, mortal child. Hatred is eternal. I have fed on the conflict between your kinds since the dawn of civilization, and I will continue long after your brief flame gutters into darkness." But the entity had not counted on the strength that flowed from genuine unity. Marcus stood shoulder to shoulder with Caelan, their combined vampiric powers creating a shield of silver light that protected Mrs. Hartwell as she chanted in a language older than recorded history. Even some of the council members who had remained loyal to Voldris began to waver, seeing in the entity's true form the puppet master that had manipulated their kind for centuries. "This is what we've served," one of them gasped, horror dawning in ancient eyes. "This is what our endless war has fed." Voldris alone remained defiant, raising the cracking binding chalice in a final desperate attempt to impose the old order. "I will not see vampire supremacy destroyed by this madness," he snarled, dark power flowing from the artifact despite its deteriorating state. But as he channeled the chalice's remaining energy, something extraordinary began to happen. The three artifacts that Ellyn bore, the soulfire blade, the phoenix feather pendant, and the moonstone locket, began to resonate not just with each other, but with a fourth presence. Caelan stepped closer to her, and she could see the same realization dawning in his pale eyes. "The bond," he whispered, wonder filling his voice. "It's not just between hunter and vampire, it's between hearts that choose love over fear." As understanding flooded through them both, they reached for each other across the chaos of the battle. The moment their hands touched, brilliant light erupted from the point of contact, and a new artifact began to form, not something crafted by ancient hands, but something created by the pure force of their willing union. The United Hearts amulet materialized in the space between their joined palms, a perfect fusion of silver and gold, light and shadow, mortal compassion and immortal strength. It was beautiful beyond description, but more importantly, it radiated a power that made even the ancient entity pause in its assault. "Impossible," Voldris breathed, the binding chalice finally crumbling to dust in his hands. "The artifacts were never meant to create something new." "They weren't," Ellyn replied, her voice carrying new authority as the amulet settled around both their necks, its chain somehow long enough to connect them while allowing freedom of movement. "But love creates its own possibilities." The transformation that followed was unlike anything the mansion had ever witnessed. Light poured from the United Hearts amulet in waves that washed over everyone present, vampire and mortal alike. But this was not the harsh light of judgment or the cold radiance of magical power. It was the warm, golden illumination of understanding, of barriers dissolved and fears conquered. Marcus gasped as the light touched him, his cruel features softening as centuries of accumulated hatred and pain began to fall away. The other vampires underwent similar transformations, their predatory edges gentling without diminishing their supernatural strength. Even Valdris staggered as the light reached him, his skeletal frame filling out as if he were remembering what it meant to feel rather than merely exist. But the most dramatic change occurred in the ancient entity itself. As the light of the United Hearts amulet touched its writhing darkness, the creature began to reveal its true nature, not an external force of evil, but a manifestation of the accumulated hatred and fear that both species had carried for too long. It was, in essence, the shadow cast by their mutual animosity, given form and purpose by centuries of violence. "We created you," Ellyn realized, her voice filled with compassion rather than accusation. "Our hatred, our fear, our inability to see past our differences, we gave you power to manipulate us." The entity's response was no longer one of rage or hunger, but something approaching confusion. "I am what you made me. Without your conflict, your violence, your endless cycle of revenge, I am nothing." "Then be nothing," Caelan said gently, his free hand extended toward the writhing shadows. "Let the hatred end with us. Let the cycle be broken by our choice to love instead of fear." The United Hearts amulet pulsed with final, brilliant radiance, and the ancient entity simply dissolved. Not destroyed, but transformed. Its malevolent energy dispersed and neutralized by the power of willing forgiveness and chosen unity. As the last of the shadows faded, dawn broke fully over Blackmore Hall, sending natural sunlight streaming through the broken windows to mingle with the gentle glow that still emanated from the amulet. The supernatural storm that had raged around the mansion dissipated, replaced by the peaceful quiet of a world where ancient enemies had chosen to become something new together. The eternal war between vampire and hunter was over, ended not by victory or defeat, but by the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over hatred, unity over division, hope over fear. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Blackmore Hall had become something unprecedented in the long history of supernatural conflict, a place where vampires and mortals worked side by side, where ancient enemies had discovered the radical possibility of friendship. Ellyn stood in what had once been the Rose Garden, watching as the first shoots of an impossible new creation pushed through the soil. The eternal garden seed that had formed in the aftermath of their union was small, as a pearl, but held within it the promise of something that had never existed before, a living symbol of harmony between mortal and immortal realms. The transformation had not been without its challenges. In the weeks following the confrontation with the ancient entity, representatives from both vampire covens and the scattered remnants of hunter families had arrived at Blackmore Hall, drawn by rumors of the impossible peace that had been forged within its walls. Some came seeking understanding, others came ready for war, convinced that any alliance between their species could only end in betrayal. It was Marcus who had proven instrumental in bridging these divides. His transformation from cruel manipulator to genuine advocate for cooperation had surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself. He had spent decades rebuilding trust, sharing his knowledge of vampire society while learning to see mortals as something more than prey or pawns. "The irony is profound," he had told Ellyn during one of their planning sessions. "I spent centuries believing that power came from dominion over others. Now I discover that true strength flows from willing cooperation, from choosing to lift others up rather than tear them down." Mrs. Hartwell had revealed her own secrets in those early days. She was not merely a housekeeper, but a guardian from an ancient order dedicated to preserving the possibility of peace between the supernatural and mortal worlds. For 40 years she had served at Blackmore Hall, waiting for the prophesied moment when the bloodlines would unite and the eternal war would finally end. "I was beginning to think I had misunderstood the signs," she admitted with maternal warmth. "But love has its own wisdom, its own timing. You and Lord Caelan found each other when the world was ready for what you represent." The United Hearts amulet had proven to be more than a symbol. It served as a conduit for unprecedented abilities that neither vampire nor hunter had possessed alone. Ellyn found she could walk in full sunlight without harm while retaining supernatural strength and speed. Caelan discovered he could taste food again, could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin without pain, could sleep peacefully instead of falling into the death-like trance that had claimed his days for centuries. Together, they had crafted new laws for their merged communities. Vampires would no longer hunt mortals, instead finding sustenance through willing donors who were compensated and protected. Hunters would lay down their silver weapons, becoming guardians and mediators rather than warriors of destruction. Both species would work together to protect humanity from the other supernatural threats that still lurked in the shadows of the world. "It's not perfect," Caelan had warned the assembled representatives during their first formal council meeting. "Peace is not a destination, but a choice we must make daily, sometimes hourly. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, individuals who choose the old ways of hatred and violence. But we have proven that another path is possible." The garden around Ellyn had grown with supernatural speed, fed by the continuing bond between her and Caelan. Where ordinary roses had once bloomed, new varieties now flourished, flowers that gleamed with silver and gold, that sang with musical voices when the wind touched their petals, that bloomed equally well in sunlight and moonlight. Thomas had returned from the village with stories of wonder, tales of how news of the peace at Blackmore Hall was spreading throughout the countryside. Some received the reports with skepticism, others with hope, but all were beginning to understand that the world had fundamentally changed. "The children are the most accepting," he reported with quiet satisfaction. "They haven't yet learned to fear what they don't understand. Give them a generation raised with these new truths, and perhaps we'll see real change take root." Ellyn felt Caelan's presence before he appeared, their bond allowing them to sense each other across any distance. He emerged from the mansion carrying 2 cups of tea, moving with the easy grace that had once seemed purely predatory, but now simply spoke of supernatural elegance put to peaceful purposes. "The morning council session went well," he reported, settling beside her on the stone bench that had become their favorite place for quiet conversation. 3 more covens have agreed to join the accords, and we received word that the hunter families in Scotland are ready to begin formal negotiations. And the resistance movements? Growing smaller each month. It's difficult to maintain hatred when the supposed enemy keeps proving beneficial rather than threatening. He smiled, an expression that had become easy and natural since the night of their bonding. Valdris has been particularly effective as an advocate. His transformation seems to carry more weight with the old guard than our arguments ever could. The former leader of the Vampire Council had indeed undergone perhaps the most dramatic change of all. The skeletal figure, consumed by centuries of accumulated malice, had become someone almost unrecognizable, still pale, still clearly vampiric, but filled with a vitality and warmth that spoke of a soul reclaimed from darkness. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the impossible garden grow around them. In the distance, they could see Marcus teaching a group of young vampires and mortal volunteers how to work together in protecting a nearby village from a pack of supernatural wolves. Mrs. Hartwell was visible through the kitchen windows, preparing a feast that would feed both species gathered for tonight's celebration. "Do you ever regret it?" Ellyn asked quietly. The choice to transform everything instead of accepting one of the Council's ultimatums? Caelan considered the question seriously, as he did all her inquiries about their shared path. "I regret the pain we've caused, those who cannot accept change," he said finally. "I regret that some chose exile rather than adaptation, but regret the choice itself? Never. We've proven that love creates possibilities that fear could never imagine." The eternal garden seed they had planted together was beginning to bloom, its first flower opening to reveal petals that seemed to hold both starlight and sunlight, mortal hope and immortal endurance. As its gentle radiance spread through the garden, other flowers began to glow in response, creating a symphony of light that spoke of harmony achieved and maintained. What do you think Isabel would say if she could see what her sacrifice ultimately created? Ellyn asked, her fingers tracing the warm metal of the United Hearts amulet. "I think," Caelan replied softly, "she would say that love always finds a way to triumph, even when the path seems impossible. Especially then." As twilight descended over Blackmore Hall, the garden's glow intensified, becoming a beacon visible for miles across the countryside. It was a symbol of hope for those ready to embrace change, a promise that ancient hatreds could indeed be overcome by willing hearts and the courage to choose a better path. The eternal war was over. The age of cooperation had begun, and in the impossible garden, where mortal and immortal magic intertwined, the future bloomed with infinite possibility.